Coming up, I didn't make this up. That actually happened exactly the way I described it, but I did omit one additional piece of information. What was it? Welcome back to Political Spirits. I'm your host, Franklin Rye. We still stand for the proposition that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. Compromise is not a requirement. If those discussions result in us changing or even abandoning our positions, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine too. We just need to talk to each other. In that way, we can unify through speech. And if the discussion becomes a bit heated at the end of the night, we should still be able to split up the bar tab and be on our way. So what are we going to talk about this week? You know what? I haven't told a lobbying story in a long time, and I've talked about the fact that I'm a professional, but I haven't talked about the fact that I'm a lawyer. So just for a little change of pace, but one that still connects back to social and political issues, for this first segment, I'm going to avoid a purely political discussion. Now, we've all heard and read about how today's youth is more sensitive to criticism. We've all heard the label snowflakes and the circumstances where colleges were so concerned about college students being stressed by conservative speakers visiting the campus that they set up rooms where upset students could play with stuffed animals or coloring books so they could deal with the stress of the presence of a speaker on campus who disagreed with them. The administrations labeled them safe spaces. If you're like me, you were flabbergasted when you read those articles. And if you're like me, they raised for you the obvious question of how on earth could a college prepare students for life in the real world if it doesn't prepare them for dealing with the everyday occurrence of encountering people who disagree with them. But none of those stories came close to flooring me as much as the one when I learned that one of those schools which had set up a safe space for its traumatized students struggling to deal with the idea that someone with whom they disagreed politically would be speaking on campus was a law school. In what universe can a law school think that it's preparing people to practice law when those students can't confront without overwhelming anxiety and the need to retreat to a room filled with stuffed animals and coloring books someone with whom they disagree? Think about how absurd it is for a law school to think a safe space is needed in that scenario. The legal system itself is an adversarial system. It's designed to find the truth by pitting two competing sides against each other, each presenting a different argument, conflicting evidence, alternative explanations. It's based on real life, because in real life not everybody agrees with each other. And the attorney's role in a civil context is to advise and represent the client to seek redress through that process. And in a criminal law role, it's to represent the interests of the state or of the person accused of a crime. The very nature of those processes is based on disagreement, is based on being presented with evidence and opinions with which you disagree. And law schools are supposed to be preparing attorneys to operate within those processes, to master those processes. How on earth can you master those processes when you can't even deal with a conflicting opinion expressed by a person in an auditorium in which you're not even sitting? And to be able to handle the stress of the existence of a person expressing an opinion contrary to your own in an auditorium in which you're not even sitting, you have to sit in a room and play with stuffed animals and coloring books. I've been an attorney for 33 years. And those decades of practice have prepared me to make detailed arguments about just about anything. But my argument in response to the ridiculous circumstance of law schools setting up safe spaces for law school students to try to handle the presence on campus of people with which they disagree boils down to nothing more than what the hell? How on earth have we reached the point where law school administrators at any law school are that disconnected from their job to produce graduates who think like lawyers and are able to competently practice law? Perhaps you're thinking I'm overreacting. Maybe you're thinking, you know what, I'll bet back in his day in law school, they really weren't that much tougher on the law students. Maybe they didn't offer them a safe space and coloring books to deal with the stress of a speaker on campus with whom they disagreed, but they probably did something to help calm those students' nerves. Perhaps they offered them a chance to hang out in the student lounge, and maybe they'd pipe in some soothing music over the public address system, perhaps something by the Carpenters. Maybe you're thinking this guy's just overdoing it, like the stereotypical grandpa explaining, "In my day, we used to have to walk miles to school barefoot through 3-foot-high snowbanks." No, I'm not overreacting. I'm not exaggerating. Let me tell you a little story to contrast law school when I went through it with the law school now offering the safe spaces with coloring books. I remember sitting in one of my classes and the professor was giving his typical lecture, and he's preparing to start asking questions, to start calling on the students, asking about the cases we'd been assigned to review. And he was a pretty tough professor, not the toughest, but certainly not one you'd ever think of as easy. And as was the norm in most classes, that professor was using the Socratic method, trying to teach the class through asking questions rather than just giving lectures containing the answers. And there was one student who was chronically unprepared, often to the point that it would encumber the process. It bogged down the learning experience. And on this particular day, he was unprepared as usual, and after being pushed on an issue, pressed by the professor to respond to a question that he absolutely should have been able to respond to, he answered, "I don't know." Well, that set the professor off, and he walked around from behind his lectern up the slope of the lecture hall until he was in front of the student, and he presented that student with a scenario. You're an associate attorney in a law firm which is handling a critical case for its client. Winning the case is critical to the survival of that client's business. An issue has come up at the last minute that will make or break your case, and you should have the information, the answer, the analysis that will provide the key to how the firm will handle the issue. You were assigned to do that research, and the senior partner in the firm looks over to you and asks you for the answer to that question, for the results of the research, of the analysis that you were to perform, and your answer is, "I don't know"? Really? You're going to look that partner in the face and respond, "I don't know"? You had one job to do and you didn't do it. Your answer is, "I don't know"? And this went on, and the result was the student was brought to tears. And the rest of the class wasn't looking around at each other thinking, "Boy, this professor's a jerk." Everyone was thinking, "It's about time." That law student was wasting our time and the professor's time and, frankly, his own time. They were thinking that student needed a wake-up call, and he got it. They weren't thinking he really should be given a safe space where he could draw on some coloring books. I didn't make this up. That actually happened exactly the way I described it. But I did omit one additional piece of information. What was it? I omitted the fact that the student was a paraplegic. He was bound to a wheelchair. This professor left his lectern to stride up the steps of the lecture hall to stand in front of a severely unprepared law student sitting in a wheelchair and confront that law student and bring him to tears. And the entire lecture hall of fellow law students recognized it was the right thing to do. And there were no safe spaces to be found anywhere. Can you imagine that happening now? Can you imagine the coverage of that exchange? There was no physical contact. There was no cursing. There was just one tough law professor demanding that law student do the work and prove that he understood it. Think that professor was too harsh? Well, ask yourself which attorney you'd want representing you when your business or your freedom is on the line. One who can handle a professor getting in his face, a professor wanting a correct, well-reasoned response on the spot, just as a judge would expect? Or an attorney who just can't take it because he was taught that when the going gets tough, the tough go for their coloring books? Well, if we don't turn our education system around, if we don't abandon the absurd idea that people are entitled to go through life or to go through school without encountering people with whom they disagree, we'll end up with a society where nobody can risk saying anything and everybody will be standing with their coloring books at the ready. Next topic. Frightening development. I recently saw something which struck me as another example of why everyone should be concerned about the future of America. I've said before that in every election before 2016, I had only two issues that I considered: the economy and national security, and which one was higher ranked for that particular voting decision varied based on the situation we faced at the time. I've also noted that in 2016 I added a third issue, and that was protection of our individual rights, most importantly, the right to free speech. I added that as an issue in that election because I saw the threat to free speech coming from the left, particularly on college campuses, and I saw it spreading into the rest of the country. Now, there's no doubt that there are great differences between the way older Americans see issues and the way younger ones do, but that's nothing new. What is surprising is how, over time, the issues which used to be near and dear to the hearts of our youth can end up being near and dear to the hearts of older Americans, and youth can start abandoning those issues outright. When I was young, free speech was talked about endlessly by young activists, by the news media, by Hollywood celebrities, by college professors, by much of society on the left with the elevated voices, with the means to reach a broader audience. Now the left is even more elevated voices because, unlike in my youth, corporate interests so often speak from the left side of the political spectrum. But what you don't hear is the widespread, vigorous defense of free speech, unless it comes in the form of defending actual rioting as opposed to speech itself. And the youth of America, for which free speech was a core issue, a cool issue, an issue that those oh-so-progressive students at Berkeley could take to heart when I was really young, and the movement at Berkeley was actually called the Free Speech Movement. That sounds pure, something as Americans we can get behind, something that recognizes that the key to preserving your free speech rights is protecting the right to engage in speech that you find objectionable. The left used to understand that, but look what's happening now. Perhaps the worst development for the future of free speech in America was something I covered in a prior episode, when the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, decided it would weigh its positions on supporting free speech against the impact of that speech on issues such as social justice. In other words, they reserve the right to not support free speech if they don't like the speech. As I've said before, it's terrifying when the preeminent free speech protecting organization in the country decides it isn't so committed to free speech. But where's that coming from, and what's the development this week that's so frightening? I think it's obvious where it's coming from. The bulk of the ACLU's support, the bulk of their financial contributions come from people on the political left, and the political left doesn't look at free speech the way they used to. Now, you can argue about whether the left changed from the days of the free speech movement at Berkeley, or whether it didn't really change at all, that for all the talk back in the heady days of that movement at Berkeley and the anti-war marching in the streets, it was never really about the right to free speech, but rather the right to free speech if that speech conformed to the views of those in the movement at Berkeley, of those anti-war activists marching in the streets, that they only wanted to protect the speech with which they agreed. I've been a conservative all my life, and I've been a supporter of free speech all my life. And while nobody would mistake the ACLU for an organization on the political right, I've always lauded its efforts. I've always seen the value which it brings to the country through its efforts to protect free speech. That's why I rightfully described it as terrifying when I found out about their change in position. And you know why they did it? I think it's obvious that they did it out of fear of losing money, of losing contributions. Is that going to change? Presumably the major contributors to the ACLU are well-heeled liberals who are probably not that young. I really don't see a lot of college students digging deep into their bank accounts or video game or pot budgets to contribute to the ACLU. So the question for the future of that ACLU position, of what I would describe as an abandonment of their core philosophy, of their core responsibility, is what do young people think? Because they aren't going to be focused on their video game and pot budgets forever. When they eventually become professors or law firm partners or business people, what are they going to think then? Are they going to look back at the ACLU's decision to factor in the impact of speech, essentially whether they like it, when deciding whether to support engaging in it, and think that's an organization that's abandoned its core values? In which case, presumably, the ACLU will have second thoughts about its decision. Or are they going to think, of course you can't have free speech when that speech goes against our social justice goals? In which case, presumably, the ACLU will pat itself on the back for that horrible decision. Well, we can find the latest evidence of what's coming by looking to Rasmussen reports. On December 17, they released an article entitled "Voters Still Cling to Free Speech, but Younger Voters Not So Sure." The article covers the results of the poll they conducted with Heartland Institute. It was conducted using both telephone and online surveys, and it found, quote, that 56% of likely U.S. voters are opposed to federal or state governments banning speech by individuals that a majority of Americans believe to be offensive, including speech on social media sites like Facebook and Twitter, close quote. The survey found that 26% support such bans and 18% are undecided. Now, those numbers struck me as worthy of a great deal of concern on their own. 56% is not exactly a huge majority, and we're talking about state and local government banning speech. It should be a massive majority of those polled who reject that idea, but it wasn't. And by the way, the poll went further by asking whether persons who violate those bans on offensive speech should go to jail. 55% said no. Just 55%. Wow. But that wasn't the really scary part of the poll results. The really scary part is that when you look at the results for only those under the age of 40, rather than 26% favoring state and local government prohibiting offensive speech, 37% favored them doing so. The message that poll sends is that America's youth, including adults all the way up through their late 30s, are moving away from supporting free speech. That's a terrifying message, and we'll be talking in future episodes about how to combat that frightening movement in the wrong direction. But for all that movement in the wrong direction, one thing will continue to move in the right direction, and that's this podcast, which will continue moving out to the public, with a new episode available next week. Please be sure to listen and tell your friends to do so as well, and like the podcast on Facebook at Political Spirits, and follow me and the podcast on Twitter at Franklin Rye. And remember, all episodes are now on YouTube as well, and the YouTube channel is named Political Spirits Network. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell, and select all after you hit the bell. This is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.